The Flame of Divine Love, The Life and Mysticism of Rabi'a al-Basri. Below is a long-form dramatization of the life of Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, often known in English simply as Rabi'a al-Basri, the 8th century Sufi mystic. While many details of her life are drawn from legends, later hagiographies, particularly Farad al-Din Attar's Tadkirat al-Awliya, and Sufi oral tradition, I have endeavoured to keep this narrative as historically and theologically accurate as possible, highlighting the themes and episodes that are commonly associated with her. The dialogue is necessarily imaginative, but reflects the pious and ascetic context attributed to Rabi'a. Throughout, quotes traditionally credited to her are included, noting that some attributions are from Sufi tradition rather than from firmly attested primary sources. This story is divided into chapters for clarity and flow. May this serve both as an engaging story and an informative look into the revered figure of Rabi'a al-Basri. Prologue. The Desert Moon. A single pale moon hung low over the desert expanse outside Basra, casting silver light on a world quiet and mysterious. The wind carried hints of the Euphrates waters, of dust, of the far-off calls of night guards patrolling the city's outskirts. It was an evening that would see the birth of a child who, though unnamed to history's keepers at that moment, would become known across the centuries as one of the greatest mystics in the Islamic tradition. The city of Basra in the early 2nd century of the Islamic calendar, the early 700s CE, was a bustling trade centre, rife with merchants, students of knowledge, and mystics. It was also a city that had seen political upheavals, theological debates, and the emergence of various ascetic movements. Basra, situated in modern-day Iraq, was a frontier city of Islamic scholarship, second only to Kufa in importance among the centres of learning in that region. In the ramshackle part of the city, where the poor tried to eke out a living, lived a humble family of devout Muslims. They owned almost nothing, though they were known for their uprightness. The father, Ismail, was a man whose head was always bowed in prayer. The mother, a gentle soul named Amir, was known for her generosity despite possessing little. Together they would welcome a 4th daughter that evening. They would name her Rabi'a, the 4th. It was said that upon her birth, an otherworldly glow suffused the small hut where her mother laboured. In some traditions it was believed that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, appeared in a dream to her father before her birth, foretelling that this child would be dear to God. Whether literal or symbolic, this dream set the tone for the hagiographical narratives that grew around Rabi'a's name for centuries to come. Here begins the story, woven of historical details, spiritual legend, and abiding devotion, of Rabi'a al-Basri. Chapter 1. The Birth of the 4th Daughter. Inside a small mud-brick home on the outskirts of Basra, dimly lit by an oil lamp that sputtered, Ismail knelt on a tattered reed mat. His calloused hands, stained with the day's labour, were raised in supplication. His lips moved in near-silent dhikr, remembrance of God. Outside, his 3 daughters slept side by side, forming a soft lull of breath beneath threadbare blankets. Though the family was poor, contentment pervaded their household. From the earliest morning hours, Ismail would walk to the central marketplace to find work, sometimes carrying goods for merchants, sometimes guarding warehouses. Any wage he earned was meagre, but it still put a little bread, water, and occasionally some dates on the family's table. Meanwhile, Amir busied herself at home, looking after the children and spinning thread by hand to sell or trade. That evening, as the labour pangs grew fierce, her breath came in short bursts. Her forehead glistened with sweat. The 3 little girls, Fatima, Mariam and Aisha, stirred from their sleep, anxious about their mother. Ismail hurried to them, placing a gentle hand on their heads. "Do not fear," he whispered. "God is with us, and your mother is strong." He guided them to the small sleeping area in the far corner, and then ran to comfort his wife. An old midwife from the neighbourhood arrived, stooped from age, carrying a small satchel of cloth and herbs. Her eyes conveyed a comforting experience. Inside that cramped space, an almost serene hush descended. The old midwife took charge, and Ismail stepped outside to pace near the doorway. He looked at the sky, filled with stars, and thought of all the blessings that had befallen them despite their poverty. As the night wore on, a cool breeze drifted by, momentarily providing relief from the day's heat. Eventually, a faint cry pierced the silence. The midwife's voice followed. "Your daughter has arrived, and mother and child are both well." A broad grin of relief and joy lit Ismail's face. He thanked God repeatedly, tears forming in his eyes. He hurried inside, where he saw his wife propped up against a rolled mat, her face pale but smiling softly. In her arms was a tiny baby girl, her breath still uneven from the first shock of life. "Praise be to God!" Ismail exclaimed. "Another daughter! Her name shall be Rabi'a, for she is our fourth gift from the Almighty." Legend has it, though no one can verify the details of that night, that a divine light glowed in the house, that angels were seen by the devout father, and that all of Basra seemed momentarily hushed. Whether mere poetic embellishment or a sign from the unseen, the story of Rabi'a's birth would be passed down among local ascetics, told with hushed reverence. Even in the earliest infancy, it was said she never cried for milk at night, lest she disturb her parents during their tahajjud, night prayer. Such stories might have been embroidered over the years, but they reflect a central truth of her legend, that her entire life was oriented toward God from the very start. That same night, as the midwife handed over the newborn to Ismail, she offered a small snippet of cloth for swaddling, noticing that the family had next to nothing to wrap the baby in. With a humble grin, he thanked her and placed Rabi'a gently in her mother's arms. "May she walk the path of righteousness," the midwife said, stooping to collect her belongings. "She has a special light in her eyes." Within the hour, neighbours came to congratulate them, men with small offerings of bread, women with sweet water and honey for the new mother. Though Ismail worried about how to feed another mouth, a deep sense of acceptance washed over him. Trials and blessings alike, he believed, come from God. "Wa ma tawfiq illa billah. My success is only by God," he whispered, echoing a Quranic verse. He gazed upon Rabi'a, her tiny hand clinging to her mother's finger, and felt a profound stirring in his heart. Chapter 2. Early Hardships. Within a few short years, the family's struggles intensified. Basra at this time was no stranger to political turmoil and natural calamities. Droughts and floods came in unpredictable cycles. Each time, the poorest communities bore the brunt. Famine and disease sometimes followed. Not long after Rabi'a began to crawl, both parents fell ill. It started with fevers, random bouts of coughing and fatigue. Yet Ismail tried to keep working. Every evening he would return with just enough bread for the family's meagre supper. Then came the night his fever burned so fiercely that he collapsed. Within days, he slipped from this world, leaving his wife and 4 daughters behind. The family's grief was overshadowed by raw survival needs. Amir took up a job washing clothes for wealthier neighbours, but that alone could not sustain them. The younger girls, now fatherless, were forced to roam the streets occasionally, begging for scraps or assistance. One morning, a neighbour found Rabi'a wandering near the marketplace, alone. She was clutching a clay bowl, half filled with water, which she was determined to bring home to her mother. Though she was barely 3 or 4 years old, an unearthly calm seemed to radiate from her. When asked why she did not cry for her father, she responded, "My father is with God. We should pray for him." The neighbour, moved by the child's composure, offered her some food. Little Rabi'a thanked him politely and quickly scurried back to her mother with her precious clay bowl. Stories like these, though simple, formed the bedrock of local lore, that even as a child, Rabi'a was possessed of an extraordinary spiritual temperament. But tragedy befell again. Not a year after Ismail's passing, her mother, weakened by grief and continuous labour, succumbed to a similar illness. Now orphans, the 4 girls were forced to fend for themselves. The 2 older sisters, Fatima and Mariam, found menial tasks as house servants, while Aisha and little Rabi'a tried to survive under the generosity of neighbours. Eventually, the hardships of the city and the cruelty of the times caused them to drift apart. In one version of the tale told by some Sufis, a man of questionable reputation noticed young Rabi'a, now perhaps around 10 or 12, in the streets. He observed her gentle bearing and the luminous quality of her eyes. One day, when no neighbours were looking after her, he abducted her. Whether out of greed to sell her into slavery or for other ignoble purposes, the sources vary. But the next time Rabi'a appears in the narratives, she is in the possession of a slave owner, a harsh master who forced her to labour long hours drawing water and cleaning. For many months, perhaps years, Rabi'a endured demeaning work and cruelty under this man's roof. Records of how she was treated, beyond the typical conditions of enslavement, are scarce, but tradition states that despite abuse, she never ceased her prayers. Even after a grueling day of hauling water, she would retire to a corner of the courtyard at night, weeping and reciting the name of God. Some nights, she would remain in sujud, prostration, until dawn, whispering prayers of gratitude, of love, not letting her heartbreak overshadow her devotion. From these earliest days, we begin to see the hallmark of Rabi'a's mystical path. Her unwavering love for the divine, often expressed in a language of intimate devotion rarely encountered at that time. In the stolen hours of darkness, she found her beloved, the only anchor in a tumultuous life. Chapter 3. Servitude and Solace. In the courtyard of her owner's house, the night silence wrapped Basra in a shimmering hush. Rabi'a sat by a small clay lamp. She had just finished scrubbing a large copper pot until her hands were red and raw. She gazed at the flickering flame, tears gathering in her eyes. Yet these tears were not of despair alone. They carried a longing only an ardent lover feels. She had learned the recitation of Quranic verses from listening to the older sisters in the family and from gleaning bits of lessons on the street. Her memory was keen. Even as she plodded through daily chores, she would mentally repeat the words she had heard. She found solace in them. Late into the evening, she began to utter a prayer, one that tradition would later preserve. O Lord, if I worship you out of fear of hell, burn me in hell. If I worship you out of hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship you for your own sake, do not withhold from me your everlasting beauty. Whether these exact words were spoken at that moment, or only in her later years, remains debated. But in the Sufi tradition, it encapsulates Rabi'a's hallmark theology of pure love. Worship is not a transaction, but an expression of the heart's deepest longing for union with the divine. She repeated these lines under her breath, her tears wetting the clay floor. There was a sense that the burden of her suffering had merged with the ecstasy of her devotion. The flame of the lamp danced, as though responding to her whispered fervour. One night, it is recounted, her master arose and, by chance, saw a radiance hovering over the spot where Rabi'a prayed. Some narrations say it was a lamp without oil, suspended by angels. Others say the moonlight fell on her in such a way as to outline her figure in luminous silver. Regardless of the details, her owner was struck with awe, realizing that this was no ordinary servant. The next morning, his manner toward her changed. Perhaps he was ashamed. Perhaps he felt fear that harming a saintly soul might bring divine retribution. Or perhaps his heart softened ever so slightly. He hesitated to beat her. He allowed her more time to pray. Before long, he made a decision. He would free her. Some attribute it to a dream that terrified him, where he was warned by a celestial voice, "Harm not my beloved, or face my wrath." Others suggest that an inner transformation led him to see the folly of keeping such a devout child as a slave. Whatever the cause, Rabi'a's shackles were removed. With only the clothes on her back and an unquenchable faith in her heart, she walked away from that house, free, yet with nowhere to go. Chapter 4. Freedom and the cloak of asceticism. Newly freed, Rabi'a wandered the streets of Basra. On occasion, a kind stranger would place a date or two in her hand. Often she was forced to skip meals, yet she never complained. She had learned that absolute reliance on God, known as tawakkul, was the true provision of the soul. She slept where she could find shelter, sometimes in abandoned courtyards, sometimes on rooftops where the night sky became her blanket. Gradually, she gathered small scraps of cloth with which she fashioned a simple cloak. This attire mirrored her inner state. She sought nothing of this world's adornments. One evening, a group of ascetic women heard her recitation of the Quran. Moved by the humility in her voice, they invited her to stay in a small communal house where they dedicated themselves to worship. She accepted. Though poor themselves, these women offered her a corner to sleep and what little food they had. It was during these years that she was introduced to the broader circles of ascetics in Basra. She heard stories of Hassan al-Basri, the famed preacher and scholar, whose sermons drew crowds for their piercing critique of worldly pursuits. She learned of Malik ibn Dinar, a man once given to sin who turned into a devout worshipper. Yet Rabi'a mostly kept to herself, preferring the silent communion of her heart with God over public debate or prominence. After some time, Rabi'a sought greater solitude. She found a small hut near the outskirts of Basra's desert plains. It was hardly more than a lean-to, but it suited her. With her own hands, she swept the floor, mended holes in the walls, and settled in. Neighbours soon whispered about the strange young woman who lived alone, rarely speaking to anyone, yet who radiated an aura of serenity. In this simple dwelling, she established a life devoted to prayer, fasting, and reflection. Over time, she became known to passers-by as a woman of barakah, blessing. Some even came to ask her for dua, supplication. She did not seek attention, but neither did she turn away those who humbly asked. Her body, weakened by years of want, grew thin. Yet her spirit seemed to grow stronger. She found in her life of utter simplicity a hidden treasure, the unwavering peace of proximity to the beloved. Occasionally she would recite poetry in her solitude, a practice not uncommon among mystics who found in verse a vehicle for expressing the ineffable. 2 ways I love thee, selfishly, and next as worthy is of thee. 'Tis selfish love that I do naught, save think on thee with every thought. 'Tis purest love when thou dost raise the veil to my adoring gaze, not mine the praise in that or this, thine is the praise in both I wis. Though again scholars debate the exact origin of these lines, they remain closely associated with Rabi'a's philosophy of mahabba, divine love. Chapter 5. Encounters with Hassan al-Basri. At that time, no figure in Basra's religious circles was more renowned than Hassan al-Basri. A prominent theologian, preacher and ascetic, Hassan, 642 to 728 CE, was revered for his eloquence and sharp moral admonitions. He had served in the court at Damascus for a brief period and later returned to Basra, dedicating himself to teaching and guiding Muslims in piety and repentance. Stories abound of an exchange between Rabi'a and Hassan al-Basri, though exact details are largely the stuff of Sufi lore. One day, Hassan heard rumours of an extraordinary woman of devotion living on the outskirts of Basra. Intrigued, he decided to visit her. In one version of the story, Hassan al-Basri arrived at Rabi'a's hut in the company of several disciples. The sun was high in the sky, making the desert heat oppressive. They found her hut quiet, with the door slightly ajar. Respectfully, they announced themselves. Inside, Rabi'a was seated on a simple mat, engaged in dhikr. Hassan, known for his dignity and scholarship, lowered his gaze and greeted her with "Assalamu alaikum." "Wa alaikum assalam," she replied softly. "Welcome, Hassan." Then, surprised that she addressed him by name, though they had never met, he bowed in courtesy. "Your reputation for piety has spread in Basra. I have come to see you and benefit from your wisdom." She invited them inside, placing a small jug of water before them. Realizing she had no cups, She offered a broken pottery shard that could hold water enough for a sip. Hassan's disciples exchanged glances. Here was the famed ascetic, for whom thousands flocked to hear sermons, meeting a woman of such poverty that even a single cup was lacking in her possession. The scene struck them with the reality of her utter detachment from worldly goods. Sensing their discomfort, Rabi'a gently said, "My home is poor, but my heart is not bereft. Contentment can be found in the remembrance of God, even if one's worldly means are few." Hassan nodded, humbled. After a moment, he ventured a question. "Tell me, Rabi'a, how did you reach this station of nearness to God?" She contemplated for a moment, then answered, "I am but a humble servant. I have no station other than to strive every moment in love for the beloved. When one truly loves, the heart can hold nothing but the beloved." Moved, Hassan is said to have remained silent for a time. Eventually, he asked for her prayers. She bowed her head and made a short supplication. "O Lord, guide Hassan and us all to what pleases you." Before leaving, Hassan offered some money as charity, thinking it might help ease her situation. She politely declined, saying, "He who has taken care of me all these years will not forsake me now." A separate anecdote recounts Hassan seeing Rabi'a carrying a torch in one hand and a jug of water in the other, walking through the night in Basra's streets. He asked her, "O Rabi'a, what are you doing with these?" She replied, "I wish to set fire to paradise with this torch and to quench the flames of hell with this water, so that none may worship God out of fear of hellfire or greed for paradise, but solely for love." Though details differ in various accounts, the underlying moral is the same. Rabi'a's devotion was directed purely toward God, unmotivated by the usual hopes and fears that animate many believers. Chapter 6. The Theology of Divine Love. To understand Rabi'a's unique contribution, we need to see her in the context of early Islamic asceticism. Pious Muslims of the first few centuries after the Prophet Muhammad's, peace be upon him, passing often emphasized khawf wa raja, or fear and hope, fear of God's punishment and hope for his mercy. The theological debates of the time often revolved around sin, repentance, and the quest for God's pleasure, with a strong focus on the afterlife's two abodes, paradise and hell. Yet Rabi'a's emphasis on pure, unadulterated love, ishq or mahabba, added a mystical dimension that would later become a cornerstone of Sufism. She taught that true worship arises not from calculations of reward or punishment, but from a heart enamored of God's beauty and majesty. In the small gatherings that formed around her hut, she would say to those who asked about her austere life, "My beloved is always with me. Why should I bother with anything in this world? When my Lord is here, the entire creation disappears from my sight." This perspective, radical for its time, helped pave the way for later Sufi saints and poets like al-Hallaj, Junayd al-Baghdad, and eventually Jalal ad-Din Rumi, who would expand on themes of divine love. One account suggests that several prominent men, some say even Hassan al-Basri, offered to marry her. They were impressed by her piety and wished to gain spiritual benefit by being close to her. But she declined all proposals, stating that her entire being belonged to God, leaving no space for earthly attachments. "In my heart, there is only room for the beloved," she was rumoured to have said. "If there were two hearts in my bosom, perhaps one could be dedicated to worldly love. But this is not the case." Though some question the historical veracity of these accounts, the motif has become emblematic. Rabi'a as the bride of the divine, wholly dedicated to worship and ascetic devotion. Chapter 7. Trials of Spirit. Rabi'a's life was not free of tribulations. One year, a severe drought struck southern Iraq. Crops failed, water supplies dwindled, and the cost of food soared. Even city dwellers who were moderately comfortable found themselves in dire straits. For Rabi'a, who already subsisted on minimal nourishment, it was a perilous time. Neighbours described seeing her during the famine, weak to the point of near collapse, yet still offering the little water she had to those worse off. When confronted, she would only say, "How can I drink when others thirst? My Lord provides for me, I need little of this world." Some nights, she would break her fast with just a handful of dates, and sometimes with nothing at all. Yet she continued in prayer, unwavering. It seemed that her body's needs were overshadowed by the flames of her devotion. An oft-repeated story claims that one of Basra's wealthier citizens, having heard of her plight, approached her with a proposition. "I will provide you with all you need, food, water, clothing, if you will come live in my household." He intended to keep her as a sort of spiritual curiosity, a pious figure who might bless his home. But Rabi'a sensed the man's motivations were mixed with a desire to own her, to display her piety as though it were a prized possession. She refused firmly, stating that she would remain in her solitude, reliant on God alone. The man pressed, "But do you not see that you are starving? God created means for human survival. Take what is offered to you." She responded, "When it pleases him to feed me, he will feed me from where I do not expect. He is the true provider." Her unwavering tawakkul left the man speechless. In the days to come, he heard rumours that despite the scarcity, Rabi'a's jug of water never fully ran out, and that a single bowl of grain lasted her for weeks. Whether miraculous or simply anecdotal, such tales solidified her reputation as one whom God specifically cared for. Chapter 8. Miracles and Anecdotes. Sufi lore is rife with miracle stories attributed to saints. One day, the tale goes, Rabi'a had gone to fetch water from a well. She carried a crude jug made of baked clay. Suddenly, it slipped from her grasp, shattering on the ground. Distraught not so much from the loss of the jug, though she had no spare, but from the difficulty of procuring another, she sat down and began to weep, supplicating to God to help her. A passerby, seeing her tears, offered to buy her a new jug. But before he could move, an unseen force or a gust of wind, a bright phenomenon of some sort, surrounded the broken pieces, and when it dissipated, the jug was whole again. Though the details are shrouded in wonder, the moral is that God's mercy answers the calls of those who trust in him wholeheartedly. Whether viewed literally or metaphorically, it underscored the message that for one who has devoted her life to God, even the smallest of needs are met in extraordinary ways. Another story suggests that Rabi'a once had a small donkey she used to carry water or wood. One day the donkey became lame and could not walk. Rabi'a dismounted, placed her head on the ground in prostration, and prayed for it to be healed. Reportedly, the donkey sprang up healthy. She is said to have rebuked the donkey gently. "Though you are but a creature, you must also serve in the path of the beloved." Such accounts have a dual symbolic function in Sufi tradition. They illustrate both the miraculous powers attributed to saints and the believer's confidence in the absolute power of God to intervene in daily life. Chapter 9. Passing Wisdom. As news spread of her sanctity, people from all walks of life came to her hut, seeking spiritual counsel. Some were ascetics desiring to deepen their devotion, others were ordinary men and women weighed down by worldly troubles. She never refused anyone, and never took a fee for her words or prayers. She would remind them, "You say, 'O Lord, forgive me,' but you do not cease from sin. Is your repentance truly sincere?" Chiding them gently, she urged them to focus on sincerity, ikhlas. She taught that the heart must yearn for God in all circumstances, through tribulation and prosperity, through tears of repentance and tears of longing. One story tells of a young scholar who boasted of memorizing 1,000 hadiths. He came to Rabi'a expecting praise. Instead, she asked him, "Do you practice what you have memorized?" Stunned, he realized the gap between knowledge and action. That day marked his transformation, and he later credited her words for leading him to genuine humility. From time to time, local ascetics and scholars, including Hassan al-Basri, Malik ibn Dinar, and Sufyan al-Thawr, are said to have visited her. In these gatherings, they would discuss themes such as detachment from the world, constant remembrance of God, and the nature of mahabba, divine love. One conversation, as recorded in later Sufi works, goes like this. Hassan al-Basri: "What do you say of the one who claims to love God but does not obey him in action?" Rabi'a: "Such a person deceives themselves. True love compels obedience, for the lover cannot displease the beloved." Sufyan al-Thawra: "How can one attain true love of God?" Rabi'a: "By forgetting oneself entirely. One must become so lost in the beloved that no thought remains for one's own desires." This emphasis on annihilating the ego, fana, would later become central to Sufi doctrine, though in Rabi'a's time, the seeds of this concept were just beginning to sprout in the hearts of the early mystics. Chapter 10. The Flame of Devotion. One of the best-known images of Rabi'a in Sufi lore is that of her praying in the desert at night, holding a burning torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other, as recounted earlier. She was heard exclaiming, "I wish to burn paradise and douse hell so that people will not worship the Almighty for fear of hell or greed for paradise but for his own sake." To some, this statement borders on the heretical. After all, the Quran itself promises reward and warns of punishment. But for Rabi'a, this was not a denial of the afterlife, but rather a radical recentering of worship on love, rather than fear or transactional desire. Later, Sufis would hail her as the pioneer of divine love, distinguishing her from the tradition of ascetic fear, khawf, and theological speculation that characterized other early figures. In her solitude, Rabi'a is said to have penned verses, oral compositions really, since she was most likely illiterate, that expressed her heart's longing. Although many of these poems were likely composed by later devotees in her name, they remain reflective of her spiritual ethos. "O Lord, the stars are shining, all eyes have closed in sleep, and the kings have locked their doors. Each lover is alone with their beloved, and here I am alone with you." Such lines have resonated across generations of mystics, capturing the essence of intimate devotions in the hush of the night. Chapter 11. Later Years and Legacy. As she advanced in years, Rabi'a's health grew ever more delicate. Nevertheless, her devotion never wavered. She would spend hours in prayer, often well beyond the recommended duties, as though sustained by an invisible force. When people asked her if her body could bear such hardships, she would reply, "This body was given to me for worship. It will rest only when it returns to its maker." Those who approached her for guidance found her gentle and free of self-importance. She refused titles of sainthood or praise. Whenever a pilgrim referred to her as a saint, she would only say, "All are servants in need of mercy. I, too, am in need." Various accounts suggest that her reputation grew beyond Basra, extending to Kufa, Baghdad, and even Damascus. But she never left her humble abode for the sake of fame. She only travelled when necessity demanded it, and even then she took no provisions beyond a few morsels of food, trusting in God to sustain her. Tradition narrates that in her last years she suffered from a lingering illness, yet her visitors noted that she was often found in a state of spiritual ecstasy. One of them asked, "Does the pain not distract you from your prayer?" She answered, "How can pain distract me from the one who sends both the test and the cure? His remembrance is sweeter than any affliction is bitter." Chapter 12. The Final Night. When the time of her passing approached, she retreated further into solitude. One night, an old friend named Salma, a fellow ascetic, stopped by to check on her. She found Rabi'a too weak to stand, lying on her straw mat, her face serene. "Rabi'a," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "Is this the end?" Rabi'a slowly opened her eyes. "There is no end, only the return. I have longed for this moment, to gaze upon my beloved without the veil of this mortal world." Suddenly her gaze fixed on a corner of the hut, as though she saw something others could not. A soft smile touched her lips and she murmured, "Labaika, Labaika." "Here I am, my lord." Salma watched in awe, feeling a tangible presence in the air. Moments later, Rabi'a breathed her last. The desert wind sighed against the humble hut, and thus the lamp of Basra was extinguished in this world, only to be kindled eternally in the realm of the unseen. News of Rabi'a's death spread quickly, and people from all walks of life gathered to pay respects. A simple funeral was held, in keeping with her ascetic lifestyle. She was buried in the outskirts of Basra, though the exact location has become uncertain over the centuries. Hassan al-Basri reportedly remarked upon hearing the news, "Truly, a shining lamp has left this world. May God be pleased with her." His sentiment was echoed by countless mourners who recognized in Rabi'a a beacon of divine love. Chapter 13. The Aftermath and Continuing Influence. After Rabi'a's passing, stories of her life became interwoven with Sufi teachings. She was hailed as a waliya, a saint, and her emphasis on mahabba guided the development of later Sufi doctrines. Farid al-Din Attar, in his Tadhkirat al-Awliya, would write of her, "She was immersed in the ocean of love, and she spoke of secrets that only the true lovers of God can fathom." Even centuries later, Sufi poets and thinkers invoked her name, praising her complete devotion. She was among the first in a lineage of women mystics who dared to center their entire existence on love for the divine. In a tradition often dominated by male voices, Rabi'a shone as a testimony to the spiritual equality promised by Islam, reminding believers that true nearness to God depends not on gender, but on sincerity of heart. Not everyone was comfortable with the language of love she employed, which seemed to overshadow the conventional framework of hope and fear. Traditional scholars emphasize that belief in paradise and hell, hope for reward, and fear of punishment were foundational. Rabi'a's focus on love did not negate these doctrines, rather, she surpassed them in her personal practice. She invited believers to go beyond the elementary stages of devotion into a realm where the soul is driven purely by love. Over time, Sufi orders that emerged, such as the Qadiriyya, the Rifa'iyya, and others, would incorporate some of her teachings, at least in spirit. While the specifics of her instructions are mostly anecdotal, the principle of loving God solely for his own sake remains a hallmark in many branches of Sufism. Chapter 14. Remembering Rabi'a. First, many stories, sayings, and poetry attributed to Rabi'a have circulated in Sufi literature. While modern historians question their authenticity, they remain profoundly inspirational. Her voice is often invoked alongside other luminaries like Bayazid al-Bistam, Junayd al-Baghdad, and later Jalal ad-Din Ruma. A few of her most famous reported utterances include, "My lord, the stars shine and men fall into slumber, but my heart is awake for you. If I worship you for fear of hell, then burn me in hell. My heart is a harp, waiting for the breath of God to release its melody." Whether or not these words were recorded verbatim, they encapsulate the essence of Rabi'a's spiritual outlook. Over the centuries, Rabi'a became a symbol of the highest spiritual achievement, a station where the soul's love for God obliterates all else. She is often held up as proof that women in Islam have played a crucial role in shaping religious and mystical thought. Her legendary humility, asceticism, and unwavering devotion testify that the path to the divine is open to all who sincerely seek it. Chapter 15. Reflections on her legacy. What does Rabi'a's life teach us today? At the most basic level, she reminds believers of the power of sincerity and trust in God. She also challenges those who approach worship as mere ritual or transaction. Her message beckons one to delve deeper into the realm of the heart, where reason surrenders to love, and the finite soul yearns for the infinite. Her emphasis on tawakkul, reliance on God, speaks to the idea that spiritual life is not about passivity, but about an active trust that sees beyond material appearances. Her refusal to accept gifts from wealthy patrons underscores her conviction that only God is the true provider. Her poetry, real or apocryphal, resonates with longing for the divine, suggesting that life's highest purpose is to kindle that longing in one's innermost being. The seeds Rabi'a sowed came to full bloom in the subsequent centuries. The language of love and union, of thirst and intoxication, emerged in the works of Mansur al-Hallaj, who famously declared, "Ana al-Haq," I am the truth, signifying his annihilation in the divine. Abu Hamid al-Ghazal, the great theologian and mystic, wrote extensively about love as an essential quality of faith. Ruma, in the 13th century, composed thousands of verses on the theme of divine love, echoing the spirit that Rabi'a embodied. Thus, while she left no formal treatise, Rabi'a's legacy endures in the hearts and writings of generations of spiritual seekers. Epilogue. The Everlasting Flame. In a dusty corner of Basra, where the desert meets the city's edge, the memory of Rabi'a al-Basri lingers. Scholars and pilgrims still seek her grave, though its exact location remains uncertain. The local lore claims that even the desert flowers bloom more brightly in the area associated with her final resting place. For centuries, Muslim mystics have invoked her name in gatherings of dhikr, praising her as the mother of the poor, the mystic of divine love, or simply Rabi'a the Ascetic. Her life stands as a testament to the heights a human soul can reach when it turns away from worldly distractions and focuses entirely on the beloved. O beloved of hearts, I have none like unto thee. Therefore have pity on me in pity's way of grace. My hope in none but thee, my trust is all in thee. Though the details of her life may have blurred in the tapestry of time, her luminous example remains, guiding seekers along the path of devotion, reminding every heart that the essence of worship is love, unconditionally, unswervingly, and eternally directed toward the one true beloved.